We're going to start this video off with finishing the disorders and treatment PowerPoint from last week. We are going to discuss etiology first, which is the set of causal factors in creating the mental health disorders. Now we use the term etiology because that is the term for studying the causation of different conditions. Now first we're going to do biological factors in the creation of mental health disorders. We've already talked somewhat about neurotransmitters and how they're related to our mental health conditions. Now we're going to look at some specific ones that are known to be factors with different conditions. First we have GABA, or the gamma aminobutyric acid. This is our primary inhibitory neurotransmitter in the brain. We've already talked about it in terms of how it can inhibit different neuron transmission, and it is related to anxiety disorders. With anxiety disorders, your brain is essentially being overactive because of not enough GABA. The next neurotransmitter is dopamine, and we've already talked about this one also in reference to schizophrenia. Dopamine is involved in several different brain processes, including the pleasure pathway with substances, but also with schizophrenia. Having too much dopamine in certain areas of the brain has been related to having the psychotic aspects of schizophrenia. We also find that dopamine is involved in both mood disorders and ADHD as well. Next we have norepinephrine. Now norepinephrine is also known as noradrenaline, and I'm betting adrenaline is a familiar term to you. So we know it's involved in our emergency reactions, our fight or flight response, but it also plays a role in emotional and behavioral regulation as well. So we'll see that norepinephrine is implicated especially in our mood disorders, and we looked at some different antidepressants that do look to increase our norepinephrine levels. And finally, serotonin. Serotonin is a neurotransmitter that's involved with a lot of just basic life processes, things like regulating sleep and awake cycles, as well as eating behavior, and somewhat our emotions as well. So we'll see that serotonin is involved with eating disorders, sleep disorders, as well as OCD, schizophrenia, and our mood conditions. Next, we'll look at structural factors in biology. Specifically, we focus on structural factors that are different in at least some people with schizophrenia. We find that a lot of people with schizophrenia have enlarged ventricles. That's what's shown in blue in this diagram here. Ventricles are simply fluid-filled structures that act as a support system for the brain. Some people with schizophrenia have these ventricles that are enlarged. Now that by itself wouldn't be much of a problem, however they are enlarged because they had to get bigger to support missing brain tissue. So some people with schizophrenia have brain tissue that's atrophied centrally located in their brain. Next we're going to look at genetics. One of the aspects of looking at genetics in transmission of mental health disorders is to look at how it combines with different environmental stressors. And that's where the diathesis stress model comes in to explain mental health conditions. That it's a combination of diathesis, or genes and other vulnerabilities, and different stressors in our life. Now we found that there is a common genetic factor that underlies schizophrenia, bipolar, autism, depression, and ADHD. So when we talk about genetics, understand we're looking at polygenic inheritance, meaning that we're not looking for one specific gene related to any of these disorders, but that there's likely multiple genes that are involved. And a combination of this gene with several others or different kinds of stressors can lead someone to develop the different mental health disorders. Now as far as our diathesis stress model, we look at our diathesis as creating a vulnerability to a mental health condition, but without the stress you won't develop a mental health condition. So you can see the diagram here is illustrating how much vulnerability. If you think about us as a cup that has to be filled for us to get a mental health disorder. The vulnerability can partway fill up the cup, but you still need the stressor to fill it all the way to actually create the mental health disorder. But those with a lower vulnerability, it would take a significant amount of stress in order to create the mental health disorder. Examples of diathesis could be genes, like we looked at just a second ago, but also brain anomalies, like what's found in some people with schizophrenia. You can also see social factors, such as maybe early childhood trauma, and psychological factors, such as unconscious conflicts or really poor skills. And then as you age, you may also experience stressors that combine with that diathesis. Stressors can also be biological, so maybe an exposure to some sort of disease or toxins. We also have social triggers like a traumatic event, something you might see with something like PTSD. And psychological triggers, maybe a violation of a trust. As far as genetics goes, one of the disorders that's most studied has been schizophrenia. Another type of study done to identify genetic contribution is the twin studies. We talked about this earlier with the developmental chapter. As far as what we find specific to schizophrenia, if one identical twin has schizophrenia, there's a 48% chance that the other one will. But we see that that percentage drops for fraternal twins who do not have 100% of the same genes. They are at about 17%. And this is pointing to other factors such as environment also playing a role. The Genane quadruplets were a well-studied set of identical quadruplets, which is rare in and of itself, but what made them interesting to researchers at the National Institute of Mental Health is that all four of them ended up developing schizophrenia or a schizophrenia-like illness. But you can find great variability in the intensity of their symptoms depending on early childhood experiences, including abuse by the father. Those of the twins that had the most abuse ended up with the most severe symptoms. Other factors in the etiology of mental health disorders include cognitive. We've talked a little bit about how the thought processes can be maladaptive for some individuals. Attributions are what we believe causes certain situations. So people who have maladaptive attributions attribute negative events to factors that are internal, stable, and global. So if you if you fail a test, a person might say that I failed the test because I didn't study hard enough, the test was too hard, or they could give an internal attribution such as I'm stupid. Someone who has this maladaptive attributional style often will consider themselves a failure or stupid, and that it's stable. It's not going to change too much across time, and global. It's not related to just this one specific instance such as a test, but just that in general they're a stupid failure and they're going to fail at everything in life. This attributional style has been associated with something called learned helplessness. Learned helplessness was first discovered when Seligman was doing research with dogs. As pictured here in the diagram, you can see what's called a shuttle box. It has a half wall in the middle, allowing the dog to go back and forth to the different sides of the shuttle box. The electrified grid in the floor was also separate. So the dog would be on one side, they would electrify the floor, it would shock the dog, and the dog would jump to the other side to escape the electric shock. And at one point during the study, Seligman had the entire floor electrified, making it so that the dog could not escape the electric shock. What happened was the dog curled up in the corner and looked depressed. They turned off the electrified grid, and then they turned back on just the side the dog was on. But at this point, the dog had given up. It didn't believe that there was anything it could do to escape the electricity, and therefore continued to sulk in a corner and look depressed. It learned to be helpless. It learned to give up, and to not expect that it could have a positive outcome. Finally, we see environmental exposures can also be related to mental health conditioning. Pictured here, you look at traumatic life experiences. We'll talk about PTSD more with the last lecture, but having exposure to traumatic events due to where you live or being in a country that's in wartime can create vulnerabilities. Culture also plays a role in determining what types of symptoms you might have, or even disorders that you might be more likely to develop. There is a condition where people fear that their genitals are retracting into their body. This is a culture-bound mental health condition that's only found in certain cultures in Asia and Africa. You don't see that in individuals here in our country. We've also already discussed how learning can play a role in the development of mental health disorders, specifically phobias, when we looked at the classic experiment with little Albert. Classical conditioning can create an association between a stimulus and a fear response. Fears can also be vicariously learned by hearing what other people are experiencing or observing it. One of the worst cases I've ever read about was a little boy who was waiting in the waiting room at a dentist's office, and another child was back getting their teeth worked on, and the dentist drill slipped. And I'm sure you can imagine the screaming that came from that room as that happened. The little boy in the waiting room, just by hearing the screaming and the pain that that other child was in, developed a dental phobia that was quite severe without ever having to have had their own direct bad experience. The last section is looking at different talk therapies. One type of talk therapy is what's called an insight therapy. Insight therapies are designed to give you insight into your problems and help you try to better understand what's going on with you. Psychoanalysis is the most common insight therapy that's used. It was originally created created by Sigmund Freud. Sigmund Freud believed that unconscious conflicts are what create our mental health symptoms. Sigmund Freud also believed you could tap into those unconscious conflicts and bring them into awareness through a process called free association. This is where you talk about anything that comes to mind as it comes to mind with no real direction being pushed on you, and the expectation is it'll just kind of flow out. Two important pieces to a psychoanalytic therapy is resistance and transference. Resistance is any time the patient is resisting the counseling process. For example, in some counseling relationships, they might assign homework for the patient to do. If they refuse to do their homework, or they stop showing up for appointments, or even just refuse to talk about certain topics, this might give you insight into what's going on and bothering them, by which topics they avoid, or what sets off sudden uncooperativeness with the therapeutic relationship. The other thing that is looked at is called transference. Transference is when you transfer your feelings that you have about someone in your life onto the therapist. So maybe you're really angry at your boyfriend, and you are now taking that anger out on your therapist as if you're angry with him or her. Now, this is actually a safe way of helping you to deal with feelings, because the therapist isn't going to judge you or be offended by the things that you say, allowing you to process through your feelings in a safe way. Now, currently, psychoanalysis has been renamed to psychodynamic psychotherapy. It's very similar with techniques as psychoanalysis. However, it's become more problem-focused. Psychoanalysis could take many years, going every week, sometimes multiple times a week, to see the therapist. Now, psychodynamic therapy doesn't try to go back to infancy and help you fix every single issue from early childhood and adolescence, but focuses more on what your current problems are today, allowing it to be a much shorter duration which makes it a little more cost-effective for many patients. Next, we're going to look at our cognitive and cognitive behavioral therapies. These therapies focus on helping you to change maladaptive attributions or cognitions and thoughts and beliefs. It's all about changing the way you think about things. Rational emotive was one of the first cognitive therapies. Now it's actually rational emotive behavioral therapy, but it heavily focused on cognitions as opposed to behaviors. Behavioral aspects of the treatment were more limited. It was created by Albert Ellis. Albert Ellis believed that any unhealthy negative emotion was related to having an irrational belief about negative events in our life. For example, your car could break down and a rational belief is, oh, this will be inconvenient till I am able to get it fixed. And it leads to a healthy negative emotion of a mild frustration. Whereas some people have irrational beliefs. Their car breaks down and it turns into, oh, well, now I'm not going to be able to get to work, and then if I don't get to work, I'm not going to be able to afford my rent, and pretty soon I'm going to be homeless, leading to unhealthy negative emotions such as depression. Albert Ellis believed there were some basic foundational beliefs that most people who have these unhealthy beliefs would exhibit. One is that it's a dire necessity for adult humans to be loved or approved by virtually every significant other person in their community. That some people feel like everybody has to love them, or it can lead them to feel bad about themselves, like they're not worthy of love or they're not a worthy individual. The next is one absolutely must be competent, adequate, and achieving in all important respects, or else one is an inadequate, worthless person. Some people feel like they have to be perfect at everything. If they fail at anything, that makes them worthless. And the third is people must act considerately and fairly, and they are damnable villains if they do not. They are their bad acts. Now, Beck also developed a cognitive therapy. Beck's cognitive therapy was based on the negative cognitive triad. According to Beck, that these three sets of negative beliefs could lead someone to experience, especially depression. So, an individual would have negative views about themselves, such as I'm worthless, negative views about the world, everyone hates me because I'm worthless, and finally, negative views about the future. I'll never be good at anything because everyone hates me. Beck also identified some specific cognitive beliefs that are associated with having issues such as anxiety or depression. You don't need to memorize these for any test, but it gives you some examples of different things that people may engage in. For example, overgeneralization, making sweeping conclusions based on a single event. So, you fail a test and suddenly it's, I'm going to fail the class, I'm going to flunk out of school, and I'm just going to fail at life. Next, we'll look at humanistic therapies. Person-centered therapy was created by Carl Rogers. You may recognize his name from our personality chapter. You probably also, or at least hopefully, also recognize the term unconditional positive regard. According to Carl Rogers, the therapist-patient relationship must have genuineness, unconditional positive regard, and empathic understanding. However, not that these were just required, but also that they were sufficient enough to help a patient get better. Genuineness is being actually genuine, showing your true feelings. So this is partly on the therapist of being open and honest with the patient, but also that the patient is able to be their true self. Unconditional positive regard we talked about with the personality chapter, and this is that other people do not require you to behave or be a certain way for them to give you any sort of positive treatment. And finally, empathic understanding. This is to be able to try to take another person's perspective and help understand them. And this is something that patients would need from the therapist. Now, according to Carl Rogers, patients just need you there to listen and give them these different things, And he wouldn't follow a direct approach. There was no direction, there was no controlling and forcing the patient to engage in anything. It was just about listening and responding positively back. Carl Rogers' main technique was to practice a reflection of feelings. So someone would talk about how they were feeling or what they were upset about, and he'd respond with, I can hear that you sound very frustrated. This seems to be bothering you a lot or stressing you out a lot. Carl Rogers actually did not ask any questions in therapy. Our other humanistic therapy is called Gestalt therapy. Now, Gestalt therapy focused on the process of what was going on in the actual room with the therapist. So a Gestalt therapist won't ask you about what's going on in your life, what happened yesterday, or what are you hoping for the future. They would focus on how you were behaving in that moment, how you're thinking and feeling while you're interacting with them. One main technique that's used often is called the empty chair technique. So if you said, oh, I'm really mad at my mom, a Gestalt therapist might say, okay, well, pretend your mom's sitting in that empty chair and tell her exactly how you feel. Another technique is called exaggeration, and this is where the therapist would have you kind of intensify any physical gesture or behavior that you're engaging in. So maybe you're tapping your foot, so they'll tell you to make it bigger. Now, by making the gesture bigger, it is hoped that it will intensify the feeling you're experiencing in that moment, allowing you to better identify what that feeling is and maybe even identify where it's coming from. Other techniques, we have solution focus. Now, solution focused is not based on the theory. It's actually based on the idea that many patients drop out of therapy before receiving benefits. So it tries to focus directly on whatever problem has taken them into therapy and tries to help them solve it in as little time as possible. So patients can already start to have relief within 2 visits to a therapist. It uses techniques such as scaling questions on a scale of 1 to 10. How much is this bothering you? And they'll use your ratings to help you try to identify solutions. So it bothers you at about a 5. What would it take to get it down to a 4? Another technique is called the miracle question. So you go to sleep tonight, and while you're sleeping, a miracle happens. When you wake up in the morning, your problem is gone. What does that look like? The thought is that through looking at what would change without having your problem, you might be able to identify what kinds of solutions you might be able to use. Therapy also doesn't always just focus on the individual. Sometimes therapy is done in groups, in families, as well as for couples. Group therapy often puts patients who have the same mental health disorders together, or ones with similar symptoms, and it can help to normalize your experience, make you feel like you're not weird or odd or out of place, as well as help to see progress that other people are having. Maybe see people that are already getting better, or what techniques might have been useful for them. Family therapy is often used when there is a child or adolescent involved, because the therapy needs to target the family and any sort of negative family dynamics as well. And couples counseling is actually fairly highly successful at helping couples who are having communication difficulties. Now, group, family, and couples counseling can all be based on any of the different techniques we've talked about already: psychoanalytic, solution-focused, or even humanistic types of therapies. And it's just done with more than one individual. Now, there are some other behavioral techniques. We talked about systematic desensitization for treating phobias, but there's also a few other behavioral techniques that may be used. Aversion therapy is often used with people who have substance abuse issues, so it's trying to classically condition an unpleasant response with the stimulus. For example, there is a drug called Antabuse that if you drink it before having alcohol, it will actually make alcohol cause you to get very nauseous and even possibly violently ill, trying to create a dissociation between alcohol and vomiting. Rewards and punishments are also sometimes used. These are mostly used with children. The examples here. Token economies are like a good job jar or a sticker chart or even a ticket system like a lot of schools use. Every time the positive behavior occurs, you give them some sort of token. And once they get enough tokens, they're able to get an actual prize. Punishment is rarely used in therapeutic relationships. The only example I can think of is for people with autism. Sometimes they engage in self-harm behavior, like slamming their heads into things or scratching up their skin. And if all other techniques have failed, occasionally they will use punishment such as a mild electric shock in order to try to deter any of that behavior. Well, that is it for the disorders and treatment chapter. Next, we'll go into our applied section, which looks at stress and health, as well as IO psychology and human factors. Alright, so now we'll start the applied psychology section, which looks at IO, or industrial organizational psychology, human factors, and health psychology. So let's first start by identifying what industrial organizational, or IO psychology is. This is how we can apply psychological principles to the workplace. So you see IO psychologists in working anywhere that people work. They are trying to help people do their jobs. Now they do this by trying to figure out how employers can treat employees fairly. So what it would take to help employees feel like there's a fair and equal balance in treatment, as well as how to make jobs more interesting and satisfying so people have higher job satisfaction and are happier in the workplace. And finally, how to help workers be more productive. So different ways that they can make jobs more interesting or satisfying is actually about designing the jobs. Sometimes it's about making work more rewarding so people feel a greater purpose, or actual rewards such as the outcomes they might get from jobs. Another aspect is to make safe and efficient work areas. Now often this is a subset of psychology called human factors, which we'll go into more later. Other things to do with helping jobs being more interesting and satisfying is to help motivate employees. So what can we do to make them perform at their best, and how to help people work together? So creating teams that will work well together, making sure that we can combine diverse talents as well as diverse perspectives. Next, we're going to watch a video on the Hawthorne effect, well, specifically on the Hawthorne studies. And we'll look at what happened in these studies and what we learned from them.
The Roaring Twenties, an era of excitement like few others in American history. An era of uproar in, well, everything. A scandalous dance called the Charleston caught on, bringing hemlines up so they could swing to the new music. Ladies bobbed their hair and covered it with cloche hats. The noble experiment tried vainly to erase demon drink from America. Speakeasies, though, became as common as prohibition agents, and bootleggers were both the heroes and the villains of the age. Scarface Al Capone was a legendary example. Harding headlined the executive branch and Teapot Dome, but America kept cool with Coolidge. A young pilot named Charles Lindbergh flew non-stop across the Atlantic and shrank the world, earning its lasting adulation. The incomparable Babe Ruth, too, was known and loved throughout the world. Perhaps the grandest star of the era was the automobile. Nothing in the 20s revolutionized the lifestyle of Americans more than the incredible motor car. Henry Ford's development of the assembly line boosted both employment and wages and set off the modern American industrial revolution. Everywhere, more and more people went to work in factories, turning out products by the hundreds of millions. But somewhere along the assembly line, the workers often got lost in the rush of production. Considered an extension of the machinery, the industrial man was often less important than his output. Working conditions were difficult, supervision usually autocratic, and benefits non-existent for most workers. In sweatshops and even in better factories, it was production that mattered. At Western Electric's Hawthorne Works in Chicago in the 1920s, telephone equipment was being manufactured by 40,000 people. What Hawthorne employees had received their company-paid pension plan back in 1906. They had vacations 1 week after 5 years, and they had sickness disability pay. Hawthorne was considered a progressive place to work.
Those who worked at Hawthorne were really respected in the neighborhood.
It was considered quite a privilege to be working here.
At this and 3 other companies in 1924, the National Academy of Science began an experiment to determine how illumination affects worker efficiency. The premise was that output would improve if the lighting of work areas was improved. Something very curious happened when new experimental lights were installed. Output went up among those employees being studied, and also among those whose lighting had not been changed. And most puzzling of all, it continued to go up even when lights were turned down. Having proved nothing, these studies were called off by the National Academy. It might all have ended there. Relay making was picked for a new experiment when Western Electric alone decided to probe the inconclusive results of the illumination studies. 6 young women assembled the electromagnetic switches while rest breaks and different hours were tried. It was the core of what would later be called the Hawthorne Studies, industry's first scientific inquiry into employee attitudes. Continuing changes in routine were freely discussed with the workers, whose output as well as involvement in the project increased dramatically. Each completed relay was counted by a tireless tape, which recorded an overall production increase of 30%. In this small room for more than 5 years, observers studied workers producing more in less time than ever before. Industrial history was in the making. The Hawthorne-Harvard Cooperative Inquiry continued into the 30s, delving into production areas all over the plant. When the early returns from the relay room began to be understood, the investigators felt the attitudes of other workers ought to be explored. They began industry's first formal employee interviewing program. Some 20,000 Hawthorne people aired their feelings about their jobs, their supervisors, their working conditions, about anything and everything. In other experiments, investigators found the first clues to the social organization of people at work, an organization that seemed to have as much or even more impact on output than anything management did. Though not all the results were as dramatic as the relay room, in general, output increased wherever these tests were tried. The investigators found industry had never tapped the workers' real worth and sent the massive proof back to Harvard for compilation.
So as you can see in the video, we find with the first set of studies that no matter whether they changed illumination, whether they kept it the same, it actually caused workers to perform better. And this illustrates the Hawthorne effect. That when someone is being observed, it's going to change how they perform. They ended up doing a group of studies, as you saw in the video also, and this helped to change how we perceive the worker within the workplace. Prior to the Hawthorne studies, most employers looked at employees as being more of an extension of the machine as opposed to human beings. And so to make workers more productive, they focused on trying to make the jobs themselves more efficient by trying to standardize the processes for work. After the Hawthorne studies, a better understanding of how to motivate employees by actually treating them like human beings, try to understand how they feel, what made them happy, how they felt about their supervision in their work environment led to the best performance. IO psychology is both a science and a practice. As a science, we find IO psychologists use the scientific method in order to try to better understand people at work. But then this research is taken in a way to practically apply it. IO psychology is also a profession where they try to apply what they found in research to real-life problems. An example of this scientist-practitioner model could be looked at with a problem where a call center has a very extensive 3-week training program for new employees, but they find that the average employee is quitting after 3 months. They're investing a lot of money into training, but they can't seem to retain the employees. So we go to the science, look at turnover theories and empirical studies and what has been shown in these studies to cause workers to quit. You can use this research in order to develop a plan on the practitioner end to try to reduce employee turnover. IO psychology is also applied in vocational and career counseling, whether it be for high school and college students to help them choose their first career, or to help employees later on in the workforce figure out how to change their career, which is becoming increasingly popular as many people are finding they're not happy. You see a lot of students who are what they call non-traditional students going back to college to find a new career path. And at the other end of the spectrum, helping people figure out what they want to do with their retirement. Many people won't be happy just sitting around with nothing much to do, so some people would like to retain part-time employment, and they may need additional career counseling for that. IO psychology is also applied in consumer psychology, figuring out what creates the preference for certain products, how do consumers choose them, so that products and advertisements can better target the consumer. As you'll notice from the diagram here, IO psychologists tend to work in consulting firms as the largest percent, with universities pretty close behind. A much smaller percentage work in the industry, with a very small percentage in government. The first aspect of IO psychology that we're going to focus on is job assessment and hiring. Many IO psychologists conduct job analysis for different organizations. This is a way of trying to identify what it takes to best do this job in order to better select employees that will meet the requirements of the job. Job analysis can take two major approaches. The first is the job-oriented approach, and the second, a personality-oriented approach. The job-oriented approach analyzes what are essential and non-essential functions that are needed to be able to complete the job successfully. Essential functions are going to be those required to do it. For example, a secretary will need to know how to type, how to have good communication skills for answering the phone and talking to customers. Non-essential functions are things that can help the person do the job more effectively, but aren't necessarily required. So maybe finding someone who is a people person, who really enjoys talking to people, would benefit the person being happier in the job, but not exactly necessary to completing the tasks. A personality-oriented approach looks at Big Five personality traits and which levels of each would be most appropriate for the job. ONET is a resource that contains pretty much every career you could think of, allowing you to look at different job analysis for the different careers, what types of functions you might have to be able to perform to complete the job, what personality traits will make you better suited to the job. It's also an interesting resource for people looking towards careers, so I encourage you to go take a look at it. It has standard incomes for the job, also whether it is a field that's growing or whether it's stagnating, because there's nothing worse than coming out of college and finding that the job market's already saturated for your intended career. Another way of assessing jobs is to look at the knowledge, skills, abilities, and other characteristics, commonly called KSAOs, that are needed to best complete the job. So it'll break it down to skills, things like critical thinking or communication skills, knowledge, so any of the background information you should already know, as well as abilities like building relationships or organizational abilities, and other characteristics such as being a people person or having a good work ethic, and breaks it down to see which is going to be most successful in helping someone complete the job so that you can match your potential employees during the interview and kind of assessment process to see if they'll fit the job well. The jobs on O-Net also break down the knowledge, skills, and abilities and other characteristics that are needed to successfully complete jobs. Ways to assess employees to see if they have the matching characteristics. Some human resources offices at different employers use psychological tests, such as situational judgment tests and integrity tests. A situational judgment test would give you a sample scenario and ask you how are you likely to perform in that situation. Integrity tests are much the same except for focusing specifically on integrity, such as honesty and theft. Integrity tests ask you questions that are meant to assess whether you might be a risky hire for the position. An example of this might be to ask, in a retail-like position, if you notice a friend of yours shoplifting items from the store, are you going to A, report it to your manager, B, call the police, C, try to convince your friend to put the items back? And it's meant to identify how likely you are to behave in an ethical and in a way that shows integrity on the job. Here you can see some different integrity test question examples, such as, would you protect your friends and coworkers like I gave you an example of someone stealing, how lenient you would be, and would you be even willing to admit thoughts? So a lot of people try to make themselves look really good on these tests, but by lying you might actually end up making yourselves look worse. Because many people have had thoughts such as thought about taking money but not actually done it, or thought about cheating on a test but not actually done it. And if you deny ever having had these types of thoughts, it may actually make it look like you're lying on the test. Interviews are another common technique, and I'm betting many of you have already had a job interview before. Job interviews can be either structured or unstructured. Structured interviews has a specific standardized set of questions that they ask every potential new hire. The link in the PowerPoint will actually take you to commonly asked interview questions. It's highly recommended that before going to a job interview, you've reviewed something like this and try to get some sample answers prepared. It can be very challenging when you're already nervous to come up with answers on the spot. Assessment centers are another way of trying to assess employees by putting them in situations and seeing how they perform. Assessment centers are specific centers that are designed for different organizations. Some will use a test called the In-Basket test, and again, this link here can take you to looking at a particular In-Basket test. The In-Basket test looks at how you prioritize different assignments. So it'll give you different activities that you have to complete, how long they take, as well as when they're due, and looks to how you process, organize, and assign priorities. During the recruiting process, it's also important to note that there are laws protecting certain groups of people. You can see on the right there the different protected classes in our country. You're protected from discrimination based on race, color, religion, national origin, gender, familial status, disability, as well as age for 40 and over. There are no federal laws currently protecting people who are lesbian, gay, or transgender. but state by state you may find protections in place, and there are many organizations that identify as not discriminating against people based on LGBT status as well. The next section is going to look at leadership. Research has shown that typically good leaders have these sets of traits. They tend to be higher on cognitive intelligence, they tend to be considered trustworthy, are team-oriented, and they are higher on agreeableness, high on emotional stability, which means low on neuroticism, high on conscientiousness, and high on extroversion. Can you think of any other traits that you would find useful in a good leader? Leaders tend to conform to one of three major leadership styles. Our transformational leadership is usually an individual who tends to focus on rationalization, or, rational thinking, trying to think logically through problems. They also tend to be more focused on individuals within their organization. So they're usually considered very caring and interested in their employees, and they may also be charismatic or charming. Transactional leaders focus on a relationship with their employees that is all about what transactions they have through rewards and punishments. So they're good at detail-oriented work and good at motivating employees in those situations. But they're not always good at motivating employees in all different types of organizations. And finally, a laissez-faire style of leadership is someone who doesn't really engage much, if at all, in the leadership process. They believe that employees do best when led through a more hands-off approach and given more freedom. Other skills that could be important in a leader also include intra- and interpersonal skills. Intrapersonal skills are skills at better understanding yourself and maybe understanding your weaknesses and strengths. Interpersonal skills are skills at being good at working with others and understanding and communicating well with other people. Once people are hired, often assessment doesn't end there. One type of assessment that many employers do is measuring job satisfaction within their organization. Research has shown that one of the most important factors in having high job satisfaction is a work-life balance. Workers want to know that their outside of work life is also important and not be put into situations where they have to choose one or the other. The next most important thing is opportunities to learn and grow. People like jobs where they're presented with challenges as well as opportunities to improve themselves or find ways to move up through the company. Other important factors include ability to accomplish goals and having good relationships with both their coworkers and their supervisors. Job satisfaction is important to organizations because it's been found to be linked to a number of different behaviors. Employees that are more satisfied with their jobs tend to have better job performance. They're also more likely to engage in organizational citizenship behaviors. Now, these are behaviors that go above and beyond the job description. Things like helping out coworkers, being willing to go the extra mile. They also tend to reduce turnover, which means employees quitting. And when employers have invested a lot of money in training and working with helping to develop the skills of employees, it can be very costly for them when employees end up leaving. Another thing that job satisfaction is associated with is absenteeism. The higher the job satisfaction, the lower the absenteeism. Many workers who are dissatisfied with their jobs end up skipping out on work. For example, taking what many people refer to as mental health days. They call in sick even though they're not because they don't want to go to work. Lower job satisfaction is also linked with aggressive and counterproductive work behavior. Things like sleeping on the job, cyber loafing, stealing, and aggression can include verbal as well as physical aggression. Job performance is also often assessed. One technique that tends to be a good technique for reducing bias is to assess job performance through a 360-degree appraisal. A 360-degree appraisal means that not just your immediate supervisor appraises your job performance, but all of the different individuals you might interact with. So your coworkers, top management, subordinates if you're also a supervisor, and even customers and yourself. This allows you to get a well-rounded perspective of all of your strengths and weaknesses. Our next section is now going to focus on human factors. Human factors is a subfield of psychology that's often considered a hybrid between psychology and engineering. One of the earliest research studies in this field looked at how different employees engaging in the same job for extended periods of time ended up having a decline in their ability to attend and focus on what they are doing. They called this a vigilance decrement. And so a lot of human factors is looking at how people and machines or tools interact. Human factors looks to design products or tools that are user-friendly. A subfield of this is called ergonomics, and you may have heard of this before. They make ergonomic chairs and desks, ergonomic keyboards, and this is all about trying to design tools and machines that can most effectively work for the employee, reducing things like injuries. For example, the little pad that's put on the front of keyboards is meant to reduce carpal tunnel syndrome. So why do we study human factors? Well, when people and machines don't work well together, it can actually create a lot of errors, and sometimes those errors can be pretty dramatic. Pictured here, you can see the butterfly ballot from Florida, the ballot that was part of a big conflict and controversy. As you'll notice, the places for voting are actually misaligned with the different candidates. And this led to a lot of people not sure what to mark in order to vote for their particular chosen candidate. Some of the goals are to reduce those types of errors. It's also about increasing safety, preventing injuries, making jobs more efficient, as well as reducing fatigue and stress. And overall, these can all be used to help improve job satisfaction as well. So it takes the aspects of things like personality, cognition and sensation and perception, how we think about and perceive the world around us, and combines it with engineering applications in terms of things like modeling and simulation computers in order to work at trying to reduce those errors, improve situational awareness, and improve safety. Human factors and IO psychology do have some overlap because they are focused on human performance and training and assessment. One of the major differences is the focus. Human factors tends to focus on task or machine design, whereas IO psychology tends to focus more on selection issues, choosing the right employees for the job. Human factors also does not exclusively focus on people at work. It looks at all different ways people interact with machines, whereas IO psychology largely just focuses on people at work. Some different techniques used for studying people include the think aloud task. So as workers or people working with a machine are completing a task, they have the users describe their task each step of the way as they perform them, looking for how they're thinking, how they're using the machines, and maybe different ways they can improve the process. The task analysis is a way of trying to break down all the different steps for completing an activity. This can allow you to try to find ways of making it easier and safer. For example, finding ways that people can make mistakes. And then the freeze probe is a way of measuring situational awareness. While someone is in the middle of completing a task, you freeze it and ask the operator about all of the events leading up to that moment to see how aware they are of what's going on. Here's an example of a task analysis. This is a hierarchical task analysis for changing a tire. And you can see every tiny step and sub-step listed here for what it would take for changing a tire. You can use this to identify different problems that could be created by missing steps, or how different actions could cause issues, so that you can figure out different hazards or errors that could result. One aspect that Human Factors is interested in is how we perceive and interpret stimuli in our environment or working with technology. One principle that tends to be applied to reduce errors is called the dual coding principle. Traffic lights are a good example of the dual coding principle. Instead of just relying on the color of the light to indicate whether you should stop, go, or wait, it also uses the position of the lights on the device to also indicate it. People know that the red light's the one at the top and the green light's the one at the bottom. So this can reduce errors for, say, people who have color blindness. They don't have to recognize the color, just the placement. So some of the primary human factors concerns are the different types of errors that we can make. One type is called a mistake. This is when you fail to formulate the right intention or the right plan. So an example of this is ruining a pie because you only had part of the recipe and you had to guess the rest of it. Slips are when you fail to properly execute the correct action. So having your fingers shifted on the keyboard could lead you to type the wrong keys. And lapses are when your memory fails you and makes you omit certain steps. So maybe you leave your keys in the ignition of your car when you go to shut your door. And mode errors are failures of memory that are tied specifically to the modes of operation. So when you turn off your cruise control, you may forget to put your foot back on the accelerator. Our last section of this lecture is looking at what's called health psychology. Health psychology is using psychological principles to study physical health and look at how we can prevent and treat illness. It recognizes that there is a connection between the mind and body. Many of our different health conditions can be looked at through the lens of lifestyle and behavior choices, but also about how we can get better can sometimes be connected to our outlook, things such as optimism. If you look at the leading causes of death, you'll notice that they are heart disease, cancer, and stroke, respectively. But the actual causes of death are many behavioral choices, things like tobacco, not dieting well, not exercising well, or even consuming substances. One of the major things health psychology focuses on is stress. Now, stress is how we deal with any sort of event that threatens or challenges us. It can create an unpleasant state of arousal when we feel like we can't cope effectively with the demands of a situation. One of the most important things to note with stress is that it is subjective. How we will experience it and what coping strategies we'll use is very individual for each person. The same stressor might be interpreted quite differently depending on the individual. For example, divorce. Some people experience divorce as extremely stressful when they're not quite able to cope with the loss of that partner. Other people see divorce as actually reducing stress in their life, and it's met with very little to no stress. Distress is an unpleasant or undesirable stressor that creates a sense of being overwhelmed. Whereas eustress is when we deal with positive events, and that creates the optimal amount of stress that helps us be healthy and have an overall sense of well-being. Things like going to college. Now, our major types of stressors include catastrophes like natural disasters or cataclysmic events like the World Trade Center tragedy. Another significant source of stress is our life changes, things like moving out of our parents' home, starting our first job. And another major type of stressor is our daily hassles. And our daily hassles end up actually creating a lot of the stress we deal with. As far as natural disasters go, research has found some really interesting but highly alarming numbers. You'll notice that for each of these natural disasters, there is an increase in the suicide rate after it occurs, with a more than 60% increase in suicide after earthquakes. Natural disasters are often very overwhelming for people to deal with. There's not just a loss of property, but also often a loss of life associated with it. When it comes to major traumas, some people can develop a condition called post-traumatic stress disorder, often called PTSD. While up to 70% of adults have experienced at least one major trauma or stressor in their life, including natural disasters, abuse, or the sudden unexpected death of a loved one, not everyone will develop PTSD afterwards. The 5 factors necessary for diagnosis of PTSD include having experienced an extreme stressor. Often it's connected with the possibility of death. You may only be a witness, such as during a bank robbery, you witness someone having a gun held to their head, but that can also be intense enough for the creation of PTSD. One of the major symptoms of the disorder is re-experiencing the traumatic event. Now, this can be through intrusive memories, nightmares, or even hallucinating that the event is reoccurring. Many people also engage in some sort of avoidance behavior, whether it's avoiding anything that reminds them of the event or avoiding emotional experiences, so having an overall emotional numbing. So they don't show much emotional expression. And individuals experience increased arousal. So this is talking about physiological arousal. They're hypervigilant, jumpy, and it may lead to some irritability. The symptoms have to last for at least 1 month in order for a diagnosis to occur. If the symptoms have begun but have not lasted a month yet, there is another condition that can be diagnosed. Significant life changes can also create a lot of stress for people because it creates a situation where we have to learn to adapt. Now, life changes, whether they're positive or negative, can create harm and stress for the individual. Finding out you're pregnant can be considered a positive event, but it's also still stressful. Overall, the research indicates that the positive stressors aren't usually as harmful as the negative stressors, but it does depend on the person and that subjective appraisal of that stressor. The Holmes and Rahe stress scale was created to measure stress from significant life changes. It has a stress score that is used to indicate how stressful each different life change would be considered. And a person calculates their score based on the number of those life changes they've experienced in the last 6 months to a year, depending on the test that is being administered. I'm asking you to take this test as your kind of class participation grade for this lecture. The link will be posted on Blackboard. One of our most common sources of stress, however, actually come from all of the little minor daily hassles that irritate us. These are often referred to as microstressors because they're not as big as things like divorce or pregnancy or major cataclysmic events, but they put a constant strain on us. So what are some of your microstressors? A lot of people list things like traffic, dealing with roommates or family members. And these accumulation of these daily stressors over time, they build up and they actually contribute more to illness than some of those major life events. A survey of middle-aged adults indicated that these are their top 10 daily hassles. And for a lot of you, I'm betting you'll find yourself right there with them, no matter what your age is. It's fairly universal across ages to be concerned about your weight or your health, the health of a family member, prices, too many things to do, or losing things. Some of the others are generally more associated with older adults, like home maintenance and yard work and taxes. But our top 10 daily hassles don't really change too much from younger adulthood to middle age. Our everyday sources of stress are often due to pressure. And this is when other people or situations like our job put a lot of demands or expectations on us. And it creates a lot of stress for us to feel like we need to try to meet all of these demands. Now, controllability is going to influence how much stress we experience from these situations. The greater the control we have, the less stress we have, and vice versa. Now, the general adaptation syndrome model is a way to illustrate how stress affects the body. That when we are exposed to a stressor, we experience first the alarm stage, much like a burglar alarm sets off that kind of panic in our body to deal with the stress. And then we'll move into resistance, and if the stress continues, eventually exhaustion. As you can see here, when we first get confronted with the stressor, we have an initial shock to the system with our resistance to stress dropping. And then during the resistance phase, our resistance increases above our normal resistance levels, and over time, eventually, we could reach exhaustion when our resources are all depleted. So phase 1 is the alarm reaction. This creates the fight or flight response. It activates your sympathetic nervous system and creates arousal in the body to mobilize us and make us prepared to deal with the threat, the fight or flight. Now, our initial exposure will create a temporary shock where our resistance drops below normal. It tends to be low as well as short, leaving us with only mild symptoms of the stress, like maybe some fatigue or headaches. As our body responds to the challenge with stress hormones like cortisol and adrenaline, we find that we go into full fight or flight mode with our temperature, blood pressure, heart rate, and respiration rate staying high. This helps us to better be able to cope with the stressors. The initial alarm symptoms will disappear and we'll have an increased resistance to stress. Now, that's only to that initial stressor. Any other stressors, we will not have that same increased resistance, leading us to maybe be irritable, snippy, or unprepared to deal with them. Eventually, if we deplete all of our resources and stay stressed too long, that can lead to exhaustion. This makes us especially vulnerable to diseases, collapse, and maybe even death. Your immune system actually gets challenged by the long-term stress, making it much more likely you'll be sick if you stay under chronic stress. One example of something that can happen in the exhaustion stage is a heart attack. Different types of personality behavior patterns can also influence how we deal with stress. Our type A behavior pattern is associated with high levels of competitiveness, striving for achievement, a sense of time urgency, hostility, and aggression. This has been shown to be a risk factor for coronary heart disease, with hostility being the main toxic ingredient. So how hostile are you? When you're in the express checkout line at a grocery store, do you find yourself counting the items in the basket of the person ahead of you to make sure they aren't over the limit? If an elevator is not coming as quickly as you think it should, do you start thinking of the inconsiderate person on another floor who's holding it up? If someone criticizes you, do you quickly begin to feel annoyed? Do you find yourself muttering at the television during a news broadcast, and I'd like to include reality show or sporting event as well? And if you're held up in a slow line of traffic, do you quickly sense your heart pounding and your breath quickening? you've said yes to any one of these, you're showing a hostile pattern of behavior that can lead you to be more at risk of coronary heart disease. So our type A behavior pattern goes with a chronic sense of time urgency. This person's always rushed, even when they don't have any sort of deadline or due date of when they need to be someplace. They have quick and abrupt speech. They'll interrupt others to speed their stories or conversations along. They'll also be competitive in non-competitive situations. One example I found from my own life, I try to complete my order at the Chick-fil-A drive-thru before the other drive-thru line person completes theirs to try and get ahead of them at the line. Not really a competitive situation, but I turn it into a competition. I've also heard people that they try to beat the time on Google Maps for when they're supposed to arrive at a destination. We associate type A with being hard-driving, achievement-oriented, status-conscious person, and it's also associated with that hostility and aggression. The type B person, on the other hand, tends to be more easygoing. They have an easier time sitting back and relaxing and enjoying their time off. They tend to be less competitive and overall more understanding and forgiving. There's also a type C personality. This is a person who's pleasant but often repressed. They tend to suppress any of their feelings of anger or anxiety and not express their emotions. Research has indicated that people with this behavior pattern have higher rates of cancer. Finally, we have the hardy personality. This is someone who thrives on stress, but they don't have the anger and hostility of the type A person. It's usually associated with a deep sense of commitment to their values and a sense of control over their lives. These people view problems as challenges to be met and answered, as opposed to something that's overwhelming and stressful. Now, the reason it's important to identify which behavior pattern you exhibit, because we find that type A men are 3 to 4 times more likely to suffer from angina, heart attacks, and sudden death than type B men. Some recent research is indicating that women who are type A have a similar risk for heart attacks and sudden death as to type B women as well. Type A personality patterns are associated with increased smoking, sleeping less, drinking more coffee, walking faster, working later, and drinking less milk. Now, if you find yourself asking why drinking less milk is on this list, it's partly because people who are not drinking milk are probably drinking less healthy fluids, things like highly caffeinated beverages that tend to increase your heart rate. Also, they tend to just overall be less health conscious. Now, when you are hostile, it can actually overwork your cardiovascular system. It causes your heart rate to increase, making your heartbeat and blood pressure go up. Hostile people also tend to be overall less health conscious, meaning they're not mediating the effects of stress. And they're overall more physiologically reactive. Anytime they're exposed to tense or stressful situations, they have a more intense and quick cardiovascular reaction. So how to deal with stress? You can take problem or emotion-focused coping techniques. You can also engage in what's called proactive coping. Problem-focused coping is exactly what it sounds like. When you're dealing with some sort of stressor, you try to confront and control and deal with the stressor. So it's about trying to use things like time management or organization. You take the stressor and you try to figure out a way to best deal with it so that it's no longer stressing you. Now, problem-focused is not always considered the most beneficial approach. It can be physiologically taxing. To constantly confront and deal with your stressors can actually lead to a more over-controlling, stress-inducing type A type of behavior pattern. Now, emotion focus can be either a shutting down type of strategy or an opening up. When it comes to shutting down, it's when you try to deny or suppress any sort of unpleasant thoughts or feelings. So you just try not to deal with it, or just to say that it's not really happening. Now, in the short term, using distraction can be an adaptive form of coping. Sometimes it's important to take a break from your stressors. But if you're always trying to suppress your thoughts and feelings, it can actually lead to something called ironic processes. So for the next 30 seconds, try not to think of a little white bear. So how did you do? Were you able to keep the thought of a white bear out of your head, or did you find it just kept popping in? Research has shown that when people were asked to do this, they just couldn't keep the image from popping into their head. And the harder they tried, the more difficult it became. So when you try to suppress your thoughts and feelings, often it keeps coming back up, and it makes you work harder and harder to try and suppress those thoughts and feelings. Emotion-focused coping using opening up techniques is actually shown to be more beneficial. Now, through this process, you have to acknowledge and try to understand your feelings and your emotional reactions to important events. So, trying to have some sort of self-awareness. And then you have to express those feelings either to yourself or someone else. So you might do it through journaling or talking about your feelings to a friend or therapist. Now, this is thought to be helpful through two different techniques. It may give you a catharsis or an emotional release. Sometimes you just feel better by getting it out. It also might help you gain insight into the problem. By talking it through, it might give you a better understanding or even help you come up with a way of better dealing or coping with the stressor. Last, we have our proactive coping. Now, proactive coping is a way of trying to anticipate and come up with a plan to prevent or kind of reduce the impact of stressors. One technique is through using social support. So having a good social support network can actually help you to talk through and have someone who can help you through stressful times. It's actually very therapeutic for people to lean on and use other people as a means of support. It improves your psychological and physical health. Social support and contact has been related to longevity or living a longer life. Now, I always recommend having at least two people you can talk to in your life. One person's great, but what if they're making you upset? You need a second person to go to talk about those problems. When it comes to talk therapy, there is actually a huge social ingredient to talk therapy. All healers are going to provide social support as well as some sort of optimistic point of view. All therapists should and communicate that there's positive expectations to give you a sense of optimism even in some of your more difficult situations. Also, a good therapist is going to help empower patients to make choices for their own treatment and help them to lead the process. Alright, so this is the end of our implied lecture. I'm going to assign you to take the Holmes and Rahe stress scale to count as your class participation for this lecture.